I'm going to show you how to buy your first rental property fast. Chances are some passive income sounds pretty nice right about now, with inflation being what it is, the job market being what it is. Maybe you're looking at Social Security, seeing the writing on the wall and wondering if it'll even be there when you need it. Let's dive right in. My name is Ryan Dossey, and I've been investing in real estate for the past 10 years. I've done everything from fix and flip to buy and hold to repositioning apartments. I've been a licensed real estate agent for the better part of that time, and I used to own and self-manage 150 units. I'm going to walk you through what you need to know to get your first rental property fast. I'm a big believer in proper expectations, so let me just give you a quick agenda for what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to cover what passive income is and what it's not. There's a lot of myths out there. After that, we're going to cover why it's getting harder to cash flow in 2025 and how to do it if you're in a competitive or expensive market. Following that, we're going to cover some common terminology that you need to understand to make sure that you don't lose money. The fourth thing we're going to cover is the importance of getting pre-approved as well as your different financing options. Following that, we're going to talk about why it's important to make sure you get a really good deal. And the last thing that I'm going to cover is how I personally found my first rentals fast without having to pay a real estate agent, getting to pick the exact properties that I want and buying them when I was ready. Chances are you're watching this video because either you're wanting to build some passive or additional income, or you're realizing your current 9-to-5 isn't going to set you up for the kind of retirement you're looking for, and you're looking to really build kind of that alternate income source. The whole reason that I'm on YouTube is to be a resource for folks like you. My goal is to be the resource that I was looking for when I first got started, and I'm a big believer in setting proper expectations, not selling the dream. So the first thing I want to cover just really quickly is that real estate investing is not passive income. In my experience, the most passive income you can generate through real estate is being the bank, funding the deals for somebody else. You're deploying the capital and they're making payments to you. Sure, you've got to make sure it's a good deal and they're a good borrower, but this whole concept of like mailbox money that you don't do anything, you just sit on the beach sipping Mai Tais and collect a check in the mail, it's a little bit more fantasy than reality. Now you can 100% outsource the parts of owning rental properties that you don't want to do, like leasing properties, handling evictions, or even plunging toilets, but it's not passive. Somebody has to do it, and it's either going to be you or a management company. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about why it's getting harder to cash flow in 2025. I'll be the first one to tell you that it is harder to cash flow in 2025 than it has been in the past. Now, the reasons for that are kind of apparent. Property taxes are at an all-time high, insurance premiums are at an all-time high, and on top of that, interest rates aren't quite so sexy right now. To give you just a really practical example, my last primary home that my wife and I owned in Pensacola, Florida, cost us right at like $2,400 a month when we bought the home back in 2019. Fast forward to when we sold it in 2023, that same home, just due to property taxes and insurance premium spikes, was costing us $3,400 a month for the exact same place. Now, imagine that's a rental property. The average tenant probably isn't going to tolerate a 30% or $1,000 a month rent increase over a couple years all that well. Now, that's not to say that you can't generate cash flow or passive income in 2025. I just want you to go into it eyes wide open. It might not just be through a conventional long-term rental in your market. In some markets, the rent-to-cost ratio is still great, and you can just buy a house, stick a tenant in it, and get paid. But let's cover what some of those terms actually mean. Let's go over a few common terms that you're going to hear thrown out by folks like me to make sure that you understand what it is you're hearing and the advice you're being given to make sure that you don't lose money on your first rental property. Now, I'll be the first one to admit I tend to talk at a high level, and sometimes I just throw out terms like cash flow or rent to cost ratio or CapEx without explaining what they are. If you're ever watching one of my videos and you don't understand what something means, throw it in the comments. I will personally answer you, and I will not shame you for asking. So the first one we should go over is cash flow. I think a lot of novice or beginner real estate investors have this concept in their brain that I have what the property rents for. I subtract out the cost of my mortgage on that, and what's left over is just profit that I can pull out of that property. And that's simply not the case. When we're trying to estimate how much cash flow a property is going to spit off or how much income we can reliably pull out of that asset, we're going to have our rent at the top. We're going to have to subtract out the cost of our mortgage, our taxes, and insurance. Out of that, we're going to have to subtract out a percentage for vacancy. That property is not going to be full all of the time. We also want to make sure we're accounting for CapEx, which I'm going to explain in a minute, as well as look at, could we outsource management? Typically, property managers are going to charge about 10% of the gross rent that is collected. And that amount left over is what you could realistically pull out of that property, or what I would call your cash flow. So in explaining cash flow, I realized I used the term CapEx, which is another confusing word, but all it really stands for is capital expenditure, or cash you're having to put into the property to cover major repairs or updates that need to be made. A good example of capital expenditure would be like putting a roof on a building that you own. Now, it's worth clarifying that capital expenditures, or CapEx, are not the same as maintenance. CapEx are things that could improve the asset, like remodeling a kitchen, or big major expenses that are required to keep it operating, like doing a roof. Whereas maintenance is more the day-to-day things like replacing a filter for an HVAC system, a water heater when it goes out, or like fixing a leak under a sink. Unfortunately, you do have to deduct both capital expenditure and maintenance costs out of your analysis to really come up with what your cash flow would be. So we've defined cash flow, we've defined capital expenditure and the difference there between CapEx and maintenance. What we have to cover next is rent to cost ratio. Rent to cost ratio is just a good, quick litmus test to use to determine if we really even want to look at this rental property further. I recently had a gentleman call me with a 4-family that he was interested in selling. He was asking $480,000 for the place, but it was only pulling in $36,000 a year in rent. In real estate, there's this thing you'll hear thrown around called the 1% rule, which basically states we want a property to rent for 1% of the value of that asset. So this property would not meet the 1% rule because it's only pulling in $36,000. Realistically, we'd be wanting a minimum of $48,000 a year. That being said, I can tell you personally, I look for about a 1.25% rent to cost ratio or better. So if I was going to buy a rental property for $100,000, minimum I would be looking for would be $1,250 a month in rent or more. The last equation that I want to talk about is cash on cash return. This is a term you'll often hear thrown out by people that are trying to sell you deals. And it's how much money you're returning based off of how much capital you have put out. So for instance, if I only put in $25,000 on that $100,000 property and was getting $1,250 in rent, it would be the equation between those two. So if you're in a market that it's hard to buy a single family and get it to cash flow, actually make passive income pay you, you might have to think outside the box a little bit. You might have to buy a duplex, which is 2 units, or a triplex, which is 3, or a quad, which is 4. You might consider looking into pad split, which is where you actually rent the rooms in a house individually. Think of it kind of like a tech-savvy boarding house. You might look into doing something like short-term rentals if you're in a travel-heavy destination or most major metros, something like VRBO or Airbnb, or you might get into mid-term rentals, which is basically renting to folks like traveling nurses or business professionals through something like Furnished Finder. The first step to buying your first rental property fast is getting pre-approved. We need to know how much money are we actually able to spend so we know what we're able to go shopping for. When I'm looking for a car, I know if I've got Toyota money or if I can roll on over to Mercedes. Now, if you're paying cash for a property, this section might not apply to you, but make sure you stick around for the cash out refinance part. The most simple way to buy a rental property, if you find one that doesn't need any repairs, is to go to a local community bank or even where you currently bank and simply put 25% down on that property. It's a very common investment style loan. Now, I do want to recommend that you begin with the end in mind and start a relationship with somebody that's going to give you a couple of the more creative products we're going to cover in a second, like cash out refinances. Now, a local community banker isn't going to be like Chase or US Bank. It's going to be somebody that has a couple local regional branches, something that might be a little bit more rural in your area, but definitely local or regional. I personally like to find these folks through icba.org. That's the International Community Bankers Association. I've personally found incredible folks to work with through them. Now, if you find a property that needs some work done to it, you're likely going to need some way to fund those repairs. Some local community banks have a product they'll do where they'll fund a percentage of your purchase, a percentage of your rehab in order to help you get that product through renovations. More often, though, you're going to be looking at something like hard money. These are loans that are typically short term. They're going to be anywhere from like 1 to 2 years on average, and they're designed to buy a property, fix it up, and refinance your capital back out of it. It's worth noting hard money loans do tend to be quite a bit more expensive in rate because it is a little bit of a riskier product. If you're networking with local community bankers, it's worth asking them if they have a product that combines the two, helps with the purchase and remodel, and allows you to refinance into more long-term affordable debt. Now let's talk about cash out refinances, which are probably the most sexy aspect of real estate financing you can get. A cash out refinance is when a bank will refinance a property and potentially pull all of your money back out and even give you some cash on top to move to your next deal.
Oh, hell yeah!
How cash out refinances work, they're going to look at the appraised value. Typically, they're going to give you somewhere between 75 to 80% of the appraised value is the debt that they will allow you to take on that project. Now, the reason why these get so much sex appeal and traction, particularly on YouTube, is because that debt you take out above and beyond what you were into it for isn't technically income because it's debt. So from a tax perspective, there's some interesting advantages there. Cash out refinances were really popularized by something called the BRRRR method, which stands for buy, renovate, rent, refinance, repeat. So the strategy is that you could buy a property, getting a good deal, which we'll talk about here in a second, renovate it, rent it out, refinance, pulling all of your original principal back out and repeat the process, potentially turning the same 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 grand into multi millions of dollars worth of assets. Pretty sexy, right?
So sexy it hurts!
In the next section, I'm going to show you how I found some of my dream rental properties early on in a brand new market with no marketing budget and without having to pay realtor fees. But before we get to that, I would be remiss if I didn't just drop a little bug in your ear about the importance of getting a very good deal, particularly on your first rental property. Over the past 10 years, I've learned that we make our money when we buy and we keep it through good property management. I'll have to do a totally separate video on that, but going out and paying retail for a property and renting it out is probably not going to set you up for success. I did a video in the past on turnkey providers. They're folks that supposedly have rental properties to sell you that have been totally renovated and rented to the perfect people and they'll never have any problems. Spoiler alert, it's a terrible idea, but I'll link to that video below as well. Why it's important to get a really good deal is so that we have equity from day one. If you want to refinance that property, you have to have equity and margin in there. The more equity you have, the more money you typically have to put down or it gets stuck in that deal, meaning you can't refinance it out. You're watching this video because you want to buy your first rental property fast, but what if that doesn't work out? Over the past 10 years, owning rentals and flipping hundreds of homes, I've bought a lot of properties from failed first-time landlords that realized this isn't for me or it's not as easy as some schmuck on YouTube made it out to be. The reason why it's important that you have equity is so that you can also afford to sell that property should you ever need to. With real estate commissions, closing costs, and fees, it's typically going to cost you between 6 to 10% the sales price of a property just in fees you've got to pay. That's not money you've got to keep. So if we have a 100K house and you sell it for 100K, you're probably walking with something like 90. Well, it'd be a shame if you paid 100K for that property because you're losing 10,000 bucks. You're paying somebody to buy that property from you. Whereas if you were only into it for 75 or 80, Even if you only got 90 back, you've turned a profit. Well, it's important to not only make sure that you're buying a property at a discount, it's also important that you make sure it will actually cash flow by analyzing the deal properly. Biggerpockets.com has some fantastic calculators that you can check out. I'm personally a big fan of dealcheck.io because it's free and they have calculators that cover not only fix and flips, but also rental properties that even include things like how much is the HOA. The last thing you want to do is buy a property thinking it will cash flow and realize you've ended up with what we call an alligator, meaning a property you have to feed money to every month to keep it alive. So at this point in the video, you're probably wanting to know, how do I find a good deal that has a great rent to cost ratio that will actually cash flow? And I'm going to show you free real ways that I've personally done it that you can go and just take action with right now. The first one, and just the most simple out there, is going to be to find a local real estate agent and make offers on stuff that's on the market. Now, your average real estate agent is not going to want to play with investment properties, and they're not going to be comfortable making the offers you would need to make in order to get a good deal. So you either need to find a real estate agent that is investment focused, or go directly to the agents yourself and just make some offers that make sense for what you would need to pay. But let's be realistic. You didn't sit through this video for some life-changing tip of like, go talk to a real estate agent. I've got cooler stuff in store for you. My first rental property when I moved to Indianapolis was a duplex. And I was able to buy this 2-unit investment property for what the property was worth 4 or 5 years before when I bought it. Now, I don't have a time machine, but if I could offer you the ability to go back to 2020 in 2025 and buy a property, would you? I don't know a single person that would say no to that question, just with how much the real estate market has appreciated. So how did I do it?
You were the only one who knows how your time machine works.
I pulled a list of expired listings on the MLS. I looked up if that individual still owned that property, and if they did, I dug up their phone number and I simply gave them a call. My pitch was the least sexy, least salesman-y thing you could imagine. It went like this. Hey, John, I see your property there at 123 Main Street. It looks like you tried to sell that a few years back, and I wish I would have seen that. I'm personally in the market looking to buy a rental. Would you consider selling that property today? My first call was a gentleman that answered and said, yeah, I would sell that property, but I'm not going to take a penny less than what I had it listed for 5 years ago. I was happy to hop in my theoretical time machine and pay him what that property was worth 5 years prior. That property was absolutely fantastic. I owned it for 3 or 4 years, and the original tenants were still in there when I sold that property later. I have other videos on this channel about how to pull a list of expired listings and find owner contact info that I can link to, but in a nutshell, you can either have an agent pull it for you out of the MLS, or you can use propstream.com or dealmachine.com to pull a list of places that were on the market but didn't sell. I would push you more towards dealmachine.com because they also include phone numbers and emails for those private property owners. The second method I want to teach you also costs nothing other than a little bit of your time, and it's simply reaching out to For Rents, asking them if they would consider selling the property instead. Now, you're going to do this particularly through Craigslist.com and Zillow for rents that are listed by the owner. I've got a full training video on how that method works right up here on YouTube that you can watch totally for free. But in a nutshell, we're going to look for properties that are listed and it appears to be done by an owner. They're not really sexily formatted. The images aren't watermarked. It's kind of like 3-bedroom, 2-bath, dogs are fine, call or text, and a phone number. Through Craigslist, all you're going to do with these is reply to the listing. I like to change the subject to match something that they either said or a picture they had. The one we got in particular that I'm thinking of, our subject line was the house with the cute little blue door. Now, the email that you're going to send on these through Craigslist is super simple. I saw the property you had listed for rent on Craigslist.com, and I'm actually curious if you would consider selling it versus renting the property out. There wouldn't be any realtor commissions or fees. We had a gentleman simply reply back, yes, and I was under contract buying his property just a few days later. The third method absolutely works, but you're gonna have to do a little bit more work, and you're gonna probably have to like kiss some frogs before you find your prince, and that's reaching out to for sale by owners. You can find for sale by owners in like your local newspaper classifieds, over on forsalebyowner.com, or through Zillow's for sale by owner search section. When reaching out to for sale by owners, you're going to be looking for places that look like they need a little bit of elbow grease, maybe a fresh coat of paint, probably not the beautifully remodeled home on the lake that they're only selling for sale by owner because they're trying to not have to pay an agent. I've personally been investing direct to seller for the past 10 years, and I've been helping folks just like you do the same since 2019. Through our group, the CCF Mastermind. We started tracking our group's results just 3 years ago, and in that time frame, our users have reported back to us over $87 million worth of profits, and that's equity in new rental properties and net from title on flips. Doesn't even include all of the cash flow. If you enjoyed this video, but you're looking for more help, book a free strategy call with my team below. As a thank you, I'll even give you a copy of my rental lease, my notice to pay or quit. It's what you send somebody if they're not paying their rent or if they're doing things like throwing parties or smoking in the property. And I'll even include our 30-day notice of non-renewal should you buy a property that you don't want that tenant to stay in there because you need to raise rents. Thank you guys for spending time with me today. Hopefully you found this valuable, actionable, and helpful. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. As I've mentioned a few times in this video, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to drop them down in the comments below. My goal is to be a resource for you, like what I was looking for when I was just getting started. Thanks again. I'll talk to you next time.